Hey everyone, Sumo Spiffy here. As promised, we are gonna get into some statistical nonsense. During the recent tier list recap, I mentioned that the Aki Basho had an unusual number of what we might call extreme records, double-digit wins or losses, especially in the Maegashira ranks. I'm sure a lot of you noticed without me having to bring it up, too. With respect to just how many of those double-digit records there were, this Basho will probably prove to be an outlier. But the way the matches were scheduled definitely had an impact, to the extent that if the trends we're going to discuss keep up, we should expect these double-digit records to become noticeably more common than they were just a few years ago. So let's start with just how unusual this tournament was. Aki 2024 had 5 Maegashira wrestlers with 10 wins, 2 more with 11, and yet another with 12. Then we had a Sekiwake with 12 wins and another with 13. The last time Pro Sumo had 3 wrestlers below Ozeki with 12 or more wins was May 2007. The last time there were 10 wrestlers below Ozeki with 10 or more wins was July 2020, so not that long ago, but that's the only other occurrence in history. And this is the first time we've ever seen 8 Maegashira wrestlers score 10 or more wins. Even going back to when Makauchi went down to like Maegashira 22, this has never happened before. We also had 1 Sekiwake and 8 Maegashira with 10 or more losses, not including Kyujos. This is definitely more than normal, but since it's common enough for guys to gimp out there when they can barely fight, this is not a historically high number. I already mentioned the schedule, but I don't want you to just have to take my word for that, so let's look at other possible reasons for why this tournament turned out the way it did. One obvious potential culprit for a bunch of Maegashira wrestlers doing really well is the Sanyaku sucking it up. And the upper Sanyaku didn't do great. There was no Yokozuna and 2 injured Ozeki who barely squeaked out winning records, and we expect more from them. But they weren't handing out free wins to everyone, and we still had 2 Sekiwake leading the tournament. That's kind of what you'd expect when no one in the upper Sanyaku is fully fit. Overall, not including Kyujos, the Sanyaku went 61-47 in total. That's plus 14 wins, which isn't amazing, but not disastrous either. At the very least, they've done a lot worse. 2 years ago, in Aki 2022, the Sanyaku went -2 overall. A combined losing record for the Sanyaku really is rare. Shodai and Mitakeumi were straight feeding wins to everyone. That tournament saw 7 Maegashira with 10 or more wins, as well as 1 Sekiwake and 1 Ozeki. Tamawashi, like Onosato this time, won the Yusho on 13-2, but unlike this time, nobody finished 12-3. So the Sanyaku was noticeably worse, but with not quite as many double-digit win totals among the rank and file. In the very next tournament, November 2022, the Sanyaku only finished at plus 7. Abi took the Yusho in a playoff over Takayasu and Takakeisho, so there were 3 guys at 12-3. But in total, only 5 Maegashira wrestlers reached 10 wins, along with another Sekiwake and Ozeki. There were also only 5 Maegashira with 10 or more losses. Yet again, the Sanyaku performed worse overall, but there were still fewer extreme records among the Maegashira ranks. More generally, the upper Sanyaku hasn't been especially dominant since Kakuryu and Hakuho retired in 2021, and the Sanyaku as a whole has had mediocre tournaments more frequently since 2020 than ever before. Yet, despite Aki 2024 not being their worst performance as a group in these last 4 or 5 years, it had the most 10-win Maegashira wrestlers in history. So we can't really lay this at the feet of the Sanyaku. There's also the possibility of it being due to variance. That is, everything was the same as usual, but just the right guys won just the right matches for us to end up with these records. And variance is unquestionably a factor. If everything in November is run as closely to the way it was in September as possible, we may very well not see as many double-digit win totals. That's why I said at the start that having so many of these records is likely to be an outlier. But I'm not making this video to claim we'll start seeing this many extreme records every Basho. It's that we're on a path to see them more consistently than we have in the past, and that this tournament may not be on its own in the record books for long. And if something happens consistently, or is set to happen consistently, that has to be for reasons beyond variance. So if this didn't happen due to the Sanyaku feeding an ungodly number of wins to the lower ranks, and I'm claiming this isn't pure variance, that leaves us with the schedule. And the trend that led to these outcomes is how they schedule later matchups in the tournament. When the Torakumi, the sumo match schedule, gets made, there's a way they sort out matches for the Sanyaku, and then everyone else gets lined up in a process dependent on rank. That lasts for the first half of the tournament for everyone and stays like that through about day 10 or 11 for most guys. But in the last 4 or 5 days, the scheduling committee leans towards matching Maegashira wrestlers with similar records as often as possible. This most famously takes the form of Darwin matches, where 2 7-7 wrestlers are matched on day 15, so one is guaranteed a winning record and one a losing record. Alternatively, matchups might be made where one wrestler with a good record at a lower rank fights another wrestler with a worse record at a higher rank. There still tends to be a fair number of matches where the higher ranked wrestler has the better record, but this is often because when guys further down in the division are doing poorly, pretty much any available opponent near the end of a tournament will have a higher rank and a better record. Matches of good record bad rank and worse record better rank tend to be more purposefully done and still take record into account, just in a different way. So once records become the primary consideration for creating matchups, it's not at all uncommon for guys with wildly disparate ranks to meet in the final days of a tournament. For example, in January 2022, Chiyomaru, Maegashira 13 East, met Wakataka Kage, Maegashira 1 East, on day 14 when they both had 7-6 records. When the schedule was made, after day 12, Chiyomaru was 7-5 and Waka was 6-6. The day 15 schedule isn't released until after day 14 is over, so once Chiyo fell to 7-7, he got matched against Ura, Maegashira 2 East, who was also 7-7. He lost that as well and finished 7-8. I use this example not because it was particularly unusual, but because it was the first such instance of these massive rank gap fights that stuck in my mind. I understood the whole Darwin match idea at that time, but with Chiyo being near the bottom of the division, having to fight both Waka and Ura on the last 2 days felt like a complete screw job. It wasn't just him even then though. The fight before his on day 15 was another Darwin match with Ichino Joe at Maegashira 2 facing Tochinoshin at Maegashira 15. Of course, Ichi won. The higher ranked guy in such a matchup usually does. Then I realized during this past July's tournament that they'd kept guys a lot closer in rank than they used to in their late Basho matchups. Ura versus Nishiki Fuji on day 14, for example, was the only match with a really huge rank differential, and the fact that match was made really drew attention to the fact such fights had become a lot less common. But even though this change was clearly happening, I couldn't tell purely from observation the degree to which it was happening, or whether it was mostly chance and I simply happened to notice. So, you know how we do, we ran the numbers. At first I just needed a small sample to see if there might be any kind of trend at play. I took January 2022, the Chiyomaru Basho, July 2024 when I noticed the change, and then November 2022 and September 2023. That way I could look at every 5th tournament during that time frame and keep the gaps between them even. I pulled all the Maegashira versus Maegashira matchups for days 12 through 15, then compared the wrestlers' ranks and their records at the time the matchup was made. For reasons I hope are obvious, we needed to use the information the schedule makers had available at the time they chose these matchups. For each match, I compared the wrestlers' records and ranks. I calculated the average win differential and rank differential for each day, as well as all 4 days for each tournament as a whole. I figured the more they focus on matching records, the more we should see a smaller gap in how many wins each guy had on average and a larger gap in their ranks. If they focus more on rank, the reverse should occur. I also marked gaps of 3 or more wins or 7 or more ranks between wrestlers in a given matchup to see if results were affected by outliers. First thing to note is that there was no real day-to-day trend to follow within a given tournament. This isn't surprising though. If a Maegashira 8, for example, and a Maegashira 12 are both struggling and look like they'll inevitably meet, that still doesn't dictate which day it happens on, and that decision affects the day-to-day swings. So the first thing I really looked at was the same day across different Bashos. The one trend that became extremely obvious was that the rank differential in Nagoya's matchups was a lot lower than the others. Nagoya had the lowest average rank gap for days 12, 13, and 15, and the second lowest, barely, for day 14. But it was also third, second, and second for having the lowest win differential. So, at least on that occasion, they didn't really have to sacrifice too much in terms of matching similar records to keep the rank gaps a lot smaller than they had in the past. Then I compared the 4-day average for each Basho against the others. Overall, the first 3 Bashos roughly followed the expected pattern. Hatsu 2022 had an average win differential of 1.47 and an average rank gap close to 6. Kyushu saw the win average drop to 1.23 and rank gap rise to nearly 7. Aki 2023 had the win diff go back up to 1.59 and the rank gap fall to 6.13. These continued swinging in opposite directions compared to Kyushu 2022, but both numbers were higher than in Hatsu 2022. The difference compared to Hatsu was relatively small though, and could largely be explained by Aki 2023 being the tournament where Atami Fuji came back to the division at Maegashira 15 and spent the first 10 days running it on dudes. That led to him facing both guys at Maegashira 2 on days 14 and 15, which skewed the averages. But Nagoya 2024's averages were 1.37 and 4.43. The win differential was only higher than Kyushu's, and the rank gap was substantially lower than any of them. There had to be a concerted effort to make matches closer in rank near the end of the tournament than had previously been the case, that much was clear. But the evidence of that wasn't simply that the rank gap was lower. As you get to the last few days, there's invariably going to be some significant rank gaps in matches, if only because the guys near the bottom have faced almost everyone else in their neighborhood. They have to have matches against guys a fair bit above them because there's almost no one else to fight. So not only was the average rank gap in Nagoya quite a bit lower just going by the objective numbers, that difference means a lot more when the effective minimum average has to be quite a bit above zero. If it's not clear what I mean, here's an example. Say Basho 1 has an average rank gap of 6 and Basho 2 has an average of 4.5. If you calculate the reduction from Basho 1 to Basho 2, the average was reduced by 25%. However, an average rank gap of 0 is impossible, and especially in the last few days, the minimum should be quite a bit above 0. Thus, if we say the average minimum rank gap is 3, then reducing the actual gap from 6 to 4.5 isn't a 25% drop, it's a 50% drop. You've cut it in half relative to how far the number can actually fall. Therefore, cutting the average to just below 4.5 is an even bigger deal than it looks on paper. That doesn't happen by luck. It requires a specific intent and effort. Still, I wasn't quite sure what to take away from this information. The win differential was still in line with the other Bashos, so it was possible the committee saw in Nagoya that they could really focus on rank and keep matchups looking about the way they used to. All that simply made Nagoya look unusual, historically speaking. So I decided to sit on it and see what happened in September. And then September went completely off the rails. Of course, once it was over, I ran the numbers. And after that, I realized it wasn't useful to have these big gaps between data points, then suddenly do two Bashos back to back. So, since I had Aki 2023 already, I did Kyushu 2023 and all the other Bashos in 2024. And what I found is, in the nerdiest way imaginable, kinda wild. Here's everything from Aki September 2023. Win difference 1.59. Average rank gap 6.13. 14 matches with a win difference of 3 or more, 14 matches with a rank gap of 7 to 9, and 7 more with a rank gap of 10 or more. This is our starting point. November 2023, 1.05 win differential, so way lower than anything else so far, but the average rank gap also went down to 5.69. Only 6 matches with a win difference of 3 or more this time, but they had 14 matches with a rank gap of 7 to 9 and 7 at a gap of 10 or more, which is identical to the previous tournament. So they seemed perfectly happy to continue matches with a wide rank differential, but it worked out that everything else brought the average rank gap down. Okay, cool. January 2024. Win differential spikes back up to 1.59 with 14 matches having a win gap of 3 or more. Those two stats are identical to September 2023 2 Bashos prior, but the average rank gap went down again to 5.45 with a gap of 7 to 9 ranks in only 9 matches and 10 or more ranks in 4. Nothing especially interesting on its own, just a continuation of the downward trend in the rank gap. March 2024, win differential falls again, this time only to 1.4. There are 8 matches with a win gap of 3 or more, but the average rank gap continues to drop now to exactly 5. A rank gap of 7 to 9 happened in 12 matches, which goes up, but only 3 matches have a gap of 10 or more. Plus, 2 of those 3 matches were Takeru Fuji going on his bonkers run to the title. May 2024, average win and rank differential both continue to drop. Win differential falls to 1.15, slightly higher than half a year ago, but still very low compared to historical norms. 6 matches have a win gap of 3 or more, identical to half a year ago, but the rank differential keeps dropping, now to 4.81, almost a full rank lower than half a year ago. 11 matches have a 7 to 9 rank gap, and another 3 are at 10 or more. At this point, it's pretty clear win differential doesn't really impact the rank gap. Across these 5 tournaments, the win differential has gone down, up, down, and down again, and not by small amounts, but the rank differential has fallen each time. The possible win differentials change every tournament based on how everyone does, so sometimes it'll be higher and sometimes lower regardless of scheduling intent. However, it also looks like the committee has realized they can keep guys somewhat close to their own neighborhood, so to speak, and still fulfill the goal of matching guys with roughly similar records near the end of a basho. Overall, it's hard to argue against this being a positive change that should increase both actual and perceived competitiveness in the final days of a tournament. July, Nagoya, we already discussed. 1.37 average win difference, so it goes up somewhat, with 10 matches having a win gap of 3+. Overall rank gap drops to 4.43, but only 7 matches had a rank gap of 7 to 9, and just one, the Ura and Nishiki Fuji match mentioned earlier, was at 10+. In fact, Ura had the 2 matches with the largest rank gaps, having faced M13 Takara Fuji on the final day. We're still not sure why Ura was the beneficiary of that and essentially no one else got those types of matchups, but that's what happened. It was, however, the first time they got the number of fights with a rank gap of 7 or more into the single digits. Then in September, at Aki 2024, the average rank differential dropped for the 7th straight basho to 4.14. 8 matches had a rank gap of 7 to 9. Only 1 had a rank gap of 10+, once again putting the total in the single digits. And in this case, it's clear why that one 10+ fight happened. After day 12, Nishikigi, Maegashira 13 West, was still technically contending for the Yusho. That meant he was going to get a higher ranked opponent. Takayasu and Wakataka Kage, though, had already claimed the available Sanyaku opponents. So Nishikigi got Oho at Maegashira 2 West since he was the highest ranked Maegashira with a winning record. This is where I should mention, for those who aren't aware, that the practice of leaving Maegashira guys with a regular schedule until they reach 8 wins, then yeeting them directly into Sanyaku matches is relatively new. Since I'm only looking at Maegashira versus Maegashira matchups here, it's reasonable to ask if this reduction in fights with large rank gaps is due to someone at, say, Maegashira 12 now going directly into a Komusubi match rather than fighting an M4, then an M1, then getting the Sanyaku. The answer is that there is an effect, but it's not much. Back in March, when Takeru Fuji had 2 of the 3 matches with a 10+ rank gap, he did get the Sanyaku matches right away. He just did so well that he ran out of relevant Sanyaku opponents. And going further back, the great majority of the matches with large rank gaps don't involve guys in the Yusho race. Just as often, if not more, it was guys doing quite badly and having to face much higher ranked opponents who are also doing quite badly. So the impact of this change isn't zero, but it doesn't appear significant enough to have to adjust the numbers to account for it. And now we get to the fun stat. Aki 2024 had an average win differential of 1.91. In other words, for every single Maegashira vs Maegashira match over the last 4 days, during the span of time where they traditionally match records that are relatively close, there was almost a 2-win gap between the wrestlers in every single fight. As you can see, that number demolishes every other basho here. But despite that average rocketing through the ozone layer, there were only 17 matches with a win gap of 3 or more. Aki 2023 and Ahatsu 2024 each had 14, which is pretty close. That means this past basho had to have some kind of win gap more consistently in the matches and fewer fights between guys holding the same record. For comparison, both May and September had 56 Maegashira vs Maegashira matches in the last 4 days. May had 21 fights scheduled between guys with identical records. September had 9. And when they didn't have the same record, the wrestler with the higher rank also had the better record in a majority of the matches. So if it seemed like there were an awful lot of mismatches in the closing days, you had good reason to feel that way. Why did it turn out like this though? To really find out, you'd have to ask the guys on the committee, and they ain't talking to nobody. All we can do is work off observation and conjecture, and the way I figure it, there's one of 2 things going on. 1, they've pushed to reduce the rank gap in late basho matchups, and for the last year they've been able to do that while keeping the win gaps at or below historical norms. Thus, they decided to stick with the same plan this basho. But then they had all these guys either blowing up or utterly imploding, and they either couldn't or wouldn't change the scheduling strategy midstream. This seems somewhat more possible because the way they scheduled day 2 was not how they usually do it, which suggested someone else was responsible for the Torakumi this time. That particular style change was reversed after day 2, but if it remained the case this new person or group was handling the schedule, it could have led to other unusual situations like what we're discussing here. Regardless of the specifics, it could well be that these extreme results were an unanticipated outcome of continuing to narrow the rank gaps in late Basho matches. If that's the case, there's a decent chance they shift a little more towards the old scheduling style in the future and keep the records of wrestlers being matched up closer together. If they can do it while keeping the rank gaps smaller, great, but if they make this kind of shift, they'll allow the rank gaps to grow a bit if necessary to maintain better balance with the records. The second option is that they actively decided to make the division more sink or swim. Shona Naomi took a complete dump on the Basho, for example. He couldn't fight Kagayaki because they're stablemates, but there were still Bushozan, Shirokuma until he got hurt, Onokatsu, lower ranked guys who he might have fought in the past with a performance this bad. But the only double-digit guy he faced was Kinbozan, and of his last 5 opponents, only Kinbo and Tobizaru were doing anywhere near as badly as he was. So it's possible the committee decided, hey, if you can't live with all the people in your neighborhood, maybe you need to move out. If that's the case, and they continue this heavier focus on rank all the way through the end of every Basho regardless of wrestler performance, this could impact guys substantially. For wrestlers who struggle in the Joy, their lives might get a little harder or a little easier. If the wrestlers from ranks 4 to 7, say, are also doing poorly, they're more likely to get fed up the ladder and the Joy wrestlers can score some more wins. But if they're doing well, those Joy wrestlers aren't as likely to pull an opponent from further down the Banzuke. They'll have to deal with the guys who are kicking ass and ready to take their spots. Mid Maegashira might get the biggest upgrade in strength of schedule. Before, if you did reasonably well, you'd have a normal schedule and you'd get the closest guys performing at the same level. That could be guys above or below you in rank. If you struggled though, you'd often be able to pick on the bottom of the division. Now, performing well leaves you with the same schedule, but doing poorly isn't going to get you cakewalk matches. This could easily lead to more guys like Kagayaki who start the tournament in a position where it would be hard for them to get demoted all the way to Juryo, but can't find any wins and get dunked down there anyway. But this is probably good for the guys at the bottom, or at least those who are Makuuchi capable. A world where nobody gets done like Chiyomaru from a few years ago is a good world for them. It's one thing if you get higher ranked opponents because you already have your 8 wins and the committee decides to see what you can handle, but another entirely when you coincidentally have the same mediocre record as a guy 12 ranks above you and you're just not ready for what might be considerable jelly. Plus, it takes the onus off the lower ranks to grind through hell and prove they belong, and puts it more on higher ranks to deal with the talent around them and prove they deserve to stay where they are. Low-key though, this outcome might be best for the Sanyaku, especially the lower Sanyaku. If the committee takes the heat off the lower ranks, that means it should be more likely for guys to spike 8 wins early if they're further down the chart. Those 8 wins now earn them a date with a Sanyaku opponent, and more Sanyaku opponents for as long as they stay in contention. Yeah, you got Takeru Fuji coming up next time and no one looks forward to fighting him, but for the most part, someone who gets on a roll at M12 or whatever is gonna be a considerable underdog to most of the Sanyaku. Getting to face those lower ranks should be an overall benefit to your Daishos and Hirodeumis as compared to an unbroken string of matches against guys at Maegashira 1, 2, and 3. And it doesn't even look bad because that protection doubles as recognition for the lower rank guys putting in a really strong performance. Of course, in Sumo, someone being on a roll makes a world of difference, and I'm not trying to say a bunch of guys are going to keep failing to run through the Komusubi roadblock, but the difference between 7 and 8 wins can be incredibly slim, and facing 1 or 2 somewhat more limited opponents than you'd otherwise have to fight can make all the difference in maintaining those ranks. But we're not going to know their plans until we get to at least the next Basho and see how they handle it. Personally, I'm a little torn on how I'd like to see it go. From a purely competitive perspective, I kinda like the idea that they don't set up the schedule to get as many guys as possible from 6 to 9 wins. It creates more movement in the rankings and potentially offers more opportunities for guys to rise quickly. But if you've got several guys struggling, at least if they face each other, you get to see which of them are better in that group right now. And that can be valuable in and of itself. What do you think though? Do you prefer scheduling that creates a lot of mid-range records, or do you prefer a setup where, if someone is ranked too high, he might get blasted all tournament long? As always, let me know in the comments. Other than that, Guess the Banzuke video will be out next week, and make sure to get your Guess the Banzuke entries in by the deadline of October 21st. Now have a great day, and I'll see you soon.